Greetings. Been up all night, so excuse my voice. I was in South Carolina, also in Charleston, and there was a report given by one of the nuclear officials from South Carolina called the Visconti Research, and he rattled on about how happy the people around the nuclear plants were as a result of some research that had been done. And I questioned him later on about who had funded the study, and of course they had. My presentation is not so refined and not so nice, so bear with me. I've been in social justice a little over 50 years, and I guess 2 or 3 decades in environmental justice. My mentors over there, Dr. Bullock, Dr. Wright, and we have, I've learned a lot about issues regarding whether it be nuclear plants or other matters that impact negatively people of color and tribal communities. So I'm going to read from my notes here, if I may. There's been a lot of talk about environmental justice. I'm amazed at now how everybody talking about environmental justice all of a sudden, as if there's some new knowledge that's been gained by it. However, it's been proven that people of low wealth and stakeholders, tribal communities, and those that live near these potentially dangerous sites are typically one that's impacted most negatively. And I'm glad that EJ Voice, One Voice, perhaps others have been invited to this meeting, this conference, if you will. It's not always been the case. What I and some others in the EJ community oppose is the business as usual in the granting of license and building and operation of these facilities. I believe, and many believe, that honest and perhaps consistent dialogue with NRC bureaucrats, industry reps, builders, and other present parties, talking to the EJ community and stakeholders could alleviate potential and real problems in the future. And when I speak of stakeholders, I do not talk about local elected officials or state officials or some federal level officials. I quote Timothy said that the love of money is the root of all evil. We have found that to be the case. There's a plant in South Mississippi or Southwest Mississippi where it's been there for quite a while, and the elected officials there are just real happy about it, and we're concerned about that. Many have sold out. Avaricious and lustful natures have caused leaders in the community, and I'm talking about black folk too, not just road-wearing white folks in the South, have sold out and have not been forthcoming, if you will. Now, for you northern types who are offended, I'm sorry. But there are those who take a few $1,000s and sell out the community. The industry giants come in and buy up the acreage and buy the souls of those elected to represent the low wealth and other stakeholders, if you will, and who are potentially in harm's way as a result of these nuclear plants. These plants are potentially life-altering. They are dangerous and a threat to life in many ways. No doubt we need a new alternative fuel source, no doubt about that. No doubt about that. This nation is in a crisis in many ways, and one of them is energy. As an EJ advocate, I realize that people of color, low wealth, and all others must share equally in the risks associated with the propagation of new energy sources, as well as the benefits, but not disproportionately. We have seen that happen for decades and all over this country. As you know, February 11, 1994, President Clinton signed the Presidential Executive Order 12898, which was a federal action to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. He tasked each federal agency to make achieving environmental justice part of its mission. DOE has claimed to embrace the executive order, as some others, and has implemented in its environmental justice strategy, and I quote, objectives to accomplish specific actions necessary to achieve environmental justice goals. very cute words. But those in the EJ community are waiting to see some of these strategies materialize on the ground. In Mississippi, we have the Grand Gulf plant located in Port Gibson, a center of poverty, low-level education, and wicked politicians. This is an area comprising a vast Afro-American population, where 75 to 80% of the populace is black, and virtually all the elected officials are people of color. The political structure has already vigorously endorsed the possibility of a new plant in the area, apparently without regard to the alarming record of the existing plant. For instance, in 1983 and 1984, the first 2 years the Grand Gulf reactor operated, significant increases were observed in local rates of infant mortalities, up 35.3%, and fetal deaths of 57.8%. Local infant mortality rates remained elevated for the next 2 decades. These rates match those experienced in the same 5 local counties during atomic bomb testing in the 1950s and 1960s, reported from the Radiation and Public Health Project, if you will. Joseph Mangano is the extractor. In 2000, the DOE accepted the conclusion of research studies that proved nuclear weapon workers suffered from high levels of cancer and other immune diseases associated with their work, and instituted a compensation program for the victims. There is some inherent danger in this. DOE, in its environmental justice strategy statements, has stated, environmental justice is not an outcome but a process. It seeks to ensure that all persons enjoy the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process, and to enjoy a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Environmental justice further strives to ensure that no population suffers a disproportionate share of adverse environmental effects. And I thought they might have copied that from Dr. Buller's book. I wasn't sure. But I wonder, though, we've not seen this sort of policy instituted south of Baton Rouge along the Mississippi River, where low-wealth citizens have been poisoned, injured, and have died from highly toxic chemicals. Yes, we need alternative energy, and fast, but its development must be fair, reasonable, and without social biases. Federal mandates must be more than mission statements or strategies, plans. There must be action plans with enforcement. It's about energy, but it's also about fetuses and babies. It's about God's ultimate creation. They are not waste sites. They are not disposable. Environmental justice cannot be left in the hands of crooked local or state federal politicians, or those soon to retire. Please take an interest, if you will, in the lives of those who are sworn to serve. To many, it's just about money. Justice, true justice, cannot be bought and sold. I believe that stakeholders must be educated about the benefits and potential dangers of, if you will, those powerful plants, those reactors, all of those big fancy words used in these meetings. Resources must be made available so that training and education will replace industry-led, bought and paid for misleading and manipulated bias studies. Sound, integrity-based education will alleviate irrational, emotion-laced rhetoric designed to create super-funded, so-called evil EJ advocates. If you will, and finally, we missed the first round, meaning the minority communities. We missed the first round of nuclear energy proliferations. Let's not miss this one. Let's be an integral part of this movement. Thank you. And remember, it only takes just one accident.
Good morning. My name is Bentina Terry, and I am the Vice President of External Affairs for Gulf Power, which is a subsidiary of the Southern Company. And I'm on this panel to talk from the perspective of a company that is in the process of having an application considered at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. As the panelists have alluded to before me, this is a very complex decision that has to be made. And at Southern Company, we are a vertically integrated electric utility. We are responsible for providing power to over 4 million customers in the southeastern United States. I think the important phase there is that we are responsible for providing that power. We have an obligation to serve those customers. And to do that, we weigh a number of different factors to determine what's the cheapest, most cost-effective way, an environmentally friendly way to provide electricity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process we've used internally to determine that nuclear power has got to be a part of our energy mix at Southern Company. Now, Southern Company operates 3 nuclear reactors, 1 in Alabama and 2 in Georgia. And as you heard earlier, there are 104 operating reactors in the United States, in 31 states, in fact. There are no new plants under construction, although many applications had been filed. And at the time I got my notes, there were 24 new units at 15 sites across the United States. But that number does change daily, as indicated before. On the worldwide front, and this is important to note as well, there are 443 operating reactors in 30 countries, with 24 under construction in 10 different countries. China alone is planning to add about 40 new nuclear plants by 2020. From a worldwide perspective, while the United States did stop building nuclear plants, most of the world continued to build. So we're in a different place than many of our international partners. So why is Southern Company considering building a nuclear plant? Well, there are 5 factors that went into our decision. And the first goes to that obligation to serve that I mentioned. That is the most important driver. One of the speakers before mentioned baseload generation. I want to take a second and explain what that is. All of you consume a certain amount of electricity on a fairly consistent basis. That means 24/7, a certain amount of electricity has got to be generated in this country to supply those needs. What we use to do that is baseload generation. Large power plants, and they're large because of the economies of scale that you get. It reduces the cost. That run 24/7. Coal and nuclear right now are the 2 baseload forms of generation that we use in this country. There's other type of generation that we call peaking generation. In other words, it comes on when you come home in the evenings and you start up stuff, or when you get up in the morning and you start up stuff, and those are mostly gas-fired generation. There is renewable generation that is used, but its output is not as consistent. As you all know, the sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. And so we as humans cannot control renewable energy much the way we control other forms of energy. But that need for baseload generation continues to grow. It is anticipated by 2030 that we'll need about 45% more electricity. And for Southern Company, most of those people are moving down south. 50% of the population increase we'll see in the United States will occur in the southeastern United States. And Southern Company provides electricity in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, and Florida, where I'm located. So we've got to be able to provide that electricity. Additionally, there are environmental benefits from nuclear. Air quality is an important driver. You guys all know that. We've been talking about climate change now very intensely for the last few years. And carbon emissions, or carbon dioxide emissions, have become increasingly more important as we consider this question of climate change. Nuclear energy plays an important role in keeping all air emissions low. It is a good choice for future generations because it is the only baseload power source we have. Remember, baseload is that's what's on all the time. It's on right now. It's 24/7. That does not contribute to these emissions. Let me give you an example. The amount of nitrogen oxide, or we call it NOx in our business, that nuclear power plants prevent annually is the equivalent of taking more than 51 million passenger cars off the road. So without those power plants, we'd have 51 million more nitrogen oxide emissions in the United States. One nuclear power plant, or the use of nuclear power in general, in 2006 caused the avoidance of nearly enough carbon dioxide emitted for every single car that was on the road in the United States. So when you talk about our air quality, when you talk about climate change, the reason why nuclear power is such a powerful component of that is because it drastically reduces those pollutants in the air. And that's very important for all of our citizens as well. Today's 104 nuclear power plants provide 20% of the United States electricity and accounts for 3/4 of all the electricity in the United States that is done today that does not emit any type of air emissions. So it is an important part of the energy that continues to provide clean, affordable, reliable energy, environmentally friendly energy to our citizens. There's a third factor, and that's fuel diversity or price volatility. I mean, how many of you have seen the price of natural gas spike, right? We all have. And for those of you that live in some parts of the United States where the majority of your generation is made from natural gas generations, you've seen huge increases, fuel increases. In my part of the country, they're pass-through costs. In other words, there are costs that go straight from the utility to the customer with no profit made by us. And we have seen those costs continue to increase over time. Natural gas fuels nearly all the electric generation capacity built in the last 10 years. That's partially because there was a moratorium on using natural gas, and that was lifted. And after that, with the experience we had with building these large baseload generating facilities and some of the costs associated with that, we did these peakers in the interim. Well, you can't do the peakers but for so long. And natural gas prices have continued to be volatile over time. Now, many of us thought coal prices, they're stable. You've seen the commercial, 40 years of coal in the United States. Well, the coal market has changed drastically in the last few years. We have gone from a domestic coal market to an international coal market. And at Southern Company, we've seen over a 300% increase in the cost of coal at our facilities. Now, luckily, most of our coal is under long-term contracts. But if we have to go out to the spot market today, we're buying coal at $125 a metric ton, where we used to buy it at $25 to $45 a metric ton. That's a substantial increase. Now, fuel accounts for 80 to 90% of the cost of electricity that's produced by fossil-fired generation. So if you take the natural gas costs and the coal costs, as they increase, it increases our costs by 80 to 90%. On the flip side, if you doubled the cost of uranium today, it would only account for a 7% increase in the cost of running a nuclear plant. That's because the fuel cost of a nuclear plant is relatively low compared to other forms of generation. So we've got fuel diversity, we've got the need for more baseload power, and we've got environmental factors. So what's the fourth factor? What's the competitive cost of nuclear plants? And there isn't anybody in the industry who wouldn't tell you that to see the cost of your nuclear plant go from a prediction of $900 million to $6 billion was quite a surprise for all of us. And we would never want to have that repeated again. But there's also an important note to the after story of that. Currently, to run a nuclear power plant, it is less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, to you, that doesn't mean a whole lot, but let me explain it to you kind of in comparative terms. It costs 2.25 cents per kilowatt hour to run a coal plant, 7.5 cents for a gas plant, 8 cents for an oil plant, about 12 to 15 cents for a wind power generation, and additionally about 25 cents for solar power. So as you see the spectrum of what it costs to run these plants, and that's the backstory. I explain to most people, when you're in our business, you have to consider what your risks are. If you build a gas-fired generation plant, you have what we call a fleet risk. Because the fuel is such a big part of the cost you pay, and because fuel costs are volatile, your entire fleet, the cost of producing generation in that plant, is going to oscillate as your fuel prices oscillate. With a nuclear power plant, you take a project risk. For the period of time that you construct that plant, you do take construction risk as you take with any large construction project. But after that plant is built, we have found over time that the cost actually stabilizes and gets much, much lower. We tend to look at the life cycle cost of the asset because just looking at what it costs to build the asset only considers 5 years when the asset runs for 60 years. And so it is the overall life cycle cost of that plant that's important. And the life cycle cost for a nuclear power plant is extraordinarily low. And so when we're looking at a competitive cost perspective, when we're looking at what cost is it we want to have our customers pay, nuclear power provides that low-cost alternative. The fifth thing, is reliability and performance. And this was alluded to earlier. The reliability of our nuclear fleet has grown substantially over time. And you heard that it's about 90%. And that means truly that 90% of the time that nuclear plant is running. That's why it's baseload generation. Other forms of generation don't run that well. Let's take solar generation. It is only going to run about 10% of the time in the best scenario. And that's not just because you think to yourself, well, Bentina, 50% of the time there's sunlight, roughly. The rest of the time there's not. It's not just whether or not the sun is shining. It's the quality of that sunlight. In the southeastern United States, I live in Florida, we're the Sunshine State. People often say, you ought to have more solar power. And we should look for more applications for solar power. But you know what makes it hot and humid and muggy in the southeastern United States? It's called cloud cover. And when you have cloud cover, it's very, very difficult for solar panels to get the amount of energy they need to produce electricity. So their capacity factor, or the amount of time that they run, is low compared to other forms of electricity. Take Arizona, where you see lots and lots of solar farms, and you see them because it's hot and dry, very little cover, and therefore a much better capacity factor in those type of states. But it's still only about 10% of the time. So when we're making these decisions, we had to ask ourselves, what about nuclear power? It doesn't have any air emissions. It provides baseload generation at a low cost. The performance of the nuclear fleet has gotten remarkably better over time. And its fuel costs are not volatile. And those 5 things would lead you to say we need to be considering nuclear power as a part of our overall energy fleet. Now, there are economic benefits to nuclear power plants, and certainly in the communities where nuclear power plants are placed, there is a great deal of change and upheaval in those communities. And it is incumbent on the electric utilities to make sure they have those dialogues before they start the plants, or before we start the plants, about the impact on that community and how we can make sure that it is as positive as possible. But I'll tell you, a nuclear power plant brings between 500 to 800 new jobs to a community. And we're not talking the $12 jobs or the $15 jobs. We're talking jobs that average around $55,000 to $60,000 a year. These are well-paying jobs. It brings some highly educated people into the communities. And in the community where Southern Company has seen our nuclear power plants, we've seen school systems that got remarkably better, and road and other infrastructure systems that are 10 times better than they were prior to the nuclear power plant going in. In fact, the economic activity around a nuclear power plant has a long-term growth outside of the nuclear power plant jobs of 500 additional jobs. And that doesn't account for those people who come in during the construction period, which is large numbers of people as well. There is approximately $350 million annually for the local communities in goods and services and labor. And in fact, Gulf Power is considering building a nuclear plant. And we took the cost of that nuclear plant, $6 billion a unit, and we said, what are the property taxes, what's the millage rate on that, and determined that by putting a nuclear power plant in one of our communities, we would actually double the county budget. Just the tax bill alone for the nuclear power plant would double that county's budget. And if you can imagine what that would do to their ability to provide infrastructure and schools and different items to the community residents who live there. Now, new nuclear, we heard a lot about that. It's not the same as it was today, and I won't go in a great deal of detail about there. There have been some substantial changes in terms of technology and in terms of the licensing of the plants. They are even safer than they are previously, and the fleet we have right now is extraordinarily safe. I worked in our nuclear power industry for a couple of years, spent a lot of time at our nuclear power plants, know lots of people that work at our nuclear power plants. And I have a lot of faith and confidence in them because you know what? They work in that plant and they live in that community, and the last thing they want is to have something happen to them and their family and their kids who are there every day. They go to church with these people. They know them well. And so you're not talking about people who don't care about that community. They are that community when you work in that nuclear power plant. And that's important to remember. And nuclear power is safe, as I said. I could go through a bunch of technical stuff about safety in depth and redundant systems, and you're probably less interested in all those technical aspects than anything else. But just suffice it to say that the amount of radiation that's produced at a nuclear power plant for one of our workers is less than the pilots who fly the Tokyo to New York route on a consistent basis. Because radiation is naturally occurring and the sun is one of the major sources. So I ended to say that Southern Company is a proponent of nuclear power as a part of our overall generation mix, and that we believe that nuclear power is a clean, safe, reliable, and environmentally friendly way to produce electricity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give the entire panel another round of applause. Now we're going to come to the part of the agenda. We're going to have some questions for the panelists. I want to ask you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to make a short statement and then a question. Like many of us, I watched I'm Dr. Beverly Wright, Director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice at Dillard University in Katrina surviving New Orleans, Louisiana. Like many of us, I watched the Discovery Channel sometimes, and about 10 years ago, there was the whole history of the nuclear energy rise in this country and how it happened and why. And it seems that with our race to the moon, the generals were pushing for nuclear energy, and the solar energy part of R&D was completely left out. So we're looking at 20, 30 years of no money put into research in solar. And so when I hear you say so eloquently, and I really would like to say, what a wonderful presentation. I wish we could get you on our side.
Okay.
We don't have that kind of money. We can't pay you like that.
Come
but
on.
I really do. I mean, I'm at an HBCU, and to see her there speaking so well is great. Just on the wrong side. But my point is that to make the statements about what we can't do with wind and solar, we really don't have a basis for that because all the money has gone into nuclear. And I often wonder what would have happened had we not been trying to go to the moon and we had moved in that direction. Needless to say, I think we'd be in a different place. But my question is, and this is where I take issue with you on, is the cost. The cost of nuclear is really being cheaper. I think that there are a lot of parts to that equation that you have not included. And I would suggest that you visit the Indian reservations where uranium mining is done and look at the cost to those people. I would also suggest that you look at the communities, and most of the people who look like us, where they live and how they are being impacted. And I also believe at this particular point in time, you know, the same kind of thing is happening. Fear about not having energy and the cost is driving all of the permits because it looks like the climate is good to get started on nuclear again. I think we need to be very cautious and think about all of the costs. And a young lady passed me an article in the newspaper right now where they have waste. What was it? Nuclear. Here it is. This Barnwell, South Carolina, where stuff is showing up everywhere, very dangerous, and they can actually be used for dirty bombs. So we do have a terrorist problem. Not terrorist problem. I don't want to sound like that group. We do have a problem with, this being used in the wrong way against our country. I'd love to talk to you after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bullard?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Bullard. I direct the Environmental Justice Resource Center at Clark Atlanta University. I have two questions. One for Mr. Matthews. Looking at the NRC's environmental justice, Executive Order 12898 mandate, of the 34 new plants and 23 proposed sites, I know each one of those individual permits require an environmental justice analysis on the NEPA, but has the NRC done an EJ analysis of where those potential 23 proposed sites are based on the executive order in terms of low income and minority population, to get a comprehensive picture of what the map looks like? And if you haven't done that, if you provide us with the coordinates, either the address or the longitude, latitude, we'll do that. The other thing is, in looking at the fact that most of those, from looking at that map, most of the sites, proposed sites, appear to be in the South, where 55% of black people live. Exactly. We are overrepresented in terms of number compared to the national population in terms of southern states. If you look at the South as the potential for where these concentrations are, that analysis has to be done, needs to be done, and is mandated by the executive order. The other point in terms of my question in terms of storage, waste disposal storage, and looking at where South Carolina has 50% of its energy from nuclear, but South Carolina also has the unique distinction of hosting Barnwell, which is turned that stayed into the waste disposal pit of the country. And if you look at Barnwell itself, it fits that pattern. Less than half of Barnwell is white. The other is African American and people of color. Mm-hmm. So this follows a pattern, I think, that needs to be examined extensively, and not just think it's something that could not happen. And we don't want history to repeat itself. And and to Ms. Terry, I think if nuclear power plants were so great, there would be lots of communities lined up to get them.
Let me real quickly respond. The question was directed towards me, associated with the 34 potential applications at 23 sites, and our environmental justice activities were the origin of those activities were the executive order to which you referred. We conduct them, however, from a legal perspective under the National Environmental Policy Act, which is referred to in that executive order as the basis for doing those evaluations. And our obligations under the National Environmental Policy Act has us conducting an environmental review within a given area for every major federal action. And any time we issue a license, it's called a major federal action. And so we conduct that review individually at each of those 23 or however many more that there are going to be, and we conduct that review as if it had never been done before. Namely, there's many of those sites for which there's already an operating nuclear power plant. But regardless of it already having a nuclear power plant, if somebody wants to build a new one, we start that review anew and do an environmental impact statement. In fact, that one that I held up the other few minutes ago was the environmental impact statement for the Southern Nuclear Plant that's proposed for Waynesboro, Georgia. And the environmental justice portion of that review I would commend to you, and in fact I can leave that copy with you to look at.
I think you're missing my point. If you put all of them on a map, all the EJ analysis on the map, would there be a pattern? That's what I'm about. Not the individual one flavor of the month.
No, I understand that, and all I was suggesting. Okay, but all I was suggesting is that our obligation under that executive order and under NEPA is to do it individually for that particular affected area, not in a generic way.
Right. Not for a big picture.
Good morning. My name is Leslie Fields. I'm the Environmental Justice Director for the Sierra Club here in Washington, and my colleagues have already laid out a lot of the good environmental justice information. Particularly, we're very concerned as more of these plants are going, have been applied for to the NRC, the effects of uranium mining. I wish we had some slides for that, because uranium mining is just horrific. It's horrific, it's horrific. No one of us would want to have to live with the effects of uranium mining. But be that as it may, and I won't even talk about the waste issues, the proliferation issues. I'm just going to throw out a few more facts that I think need to be highlighted about how this industry is really not cost effective. And one of the things is that this industry gets a lot of tax incentives from the federal government. And compared to what as Dr. Wright said, basically about $77 billion in the past 50 years have just gone for tax incentives for this nuclear industry, as opposed to about $50 billion for oil and gas, maybe about $12 billion or so. There is some money that goes into other renewable energy. But the ratio between what the nuclear industry gets and what the others get, compared and also to the oil and gas, is very, very high. The nuclear industry has great lawyers. I commend them as a lawyer, because what they have done, they helped get a law called PriceAnderson passed. PriceAnderson is a law that states that the nuclear industry has absolutely no liability in the face of a catastrophic accident. No other industry has this. Think about it. The taxpayers are going to have to pay. You would have to pay if you have a facility in your neighborhood leaking some radioactive material into your water supply. The taxpayers have to clean it up. Okay? No one else has that. Also, the federal government also assumes the cost of what we're going to do with this waste. The taxpayers have to assume this cost. Again, no one under industry gets to do that. And there's lots of programs for these new plants to come online. The Department of Energy has a wonderful incentive program, and they have a cost-sharing incentive program with the nuclear industry, which is now it's called Nuclear something 2010. And the Department of Energy, taxpayer-funded agency, is kicking in $500 million of incentives for these new plants to come online. So my point is that this industry is very much supported by the taxpayers, and I just love PriceAnderson. I wish every industry should have that, all right? But so I commend this industry for, getting what they need, but I think this needs to come out to the community. People need to understand this so they can make informed decisions of whether or not they want these facilities in their neighborhoods. All the facts need to get out. I'm glad you brought in all the base load and all that stuff, but all these other facts need to get out as well. And there's lots of organizations who work on this, and I'm happy to talk to anyone else about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Do you mind if I, just for a little bit of clarification, PriceAnderson is the insurance scheme for nuclear plants. But much like you pay a premium on your house, all nuclear companies pay a premium in order to be covered by PriceAnderson. And that money is pooled, and it's only available for an accident. And she is correct. There's a deductible. It's just like any insurance company in the sense that it is funded by those people who use that insurance. And then, over time, there's been very little that's come out of PriceAnderson. The secondary point is very true. It's very true. It's very true that there are incentives for nuclear power, and there is a Nuclear Power 2010 program. But as I would tell most people, if you look at the Energy Policy Act of 2006, the one that just passed, there are also incentives of an equal or better value for other types of technology, including wind and solar and IGCC. I don't doubt that there's been a lot of money over time put into the nuclear power industry, partially, though, because all of the submarines, or many of them that are off our coast, run by our Navy, are powered by nuclear power. And nuclear power has several other applications besides the production of electricity. So part of the funding that you see for nuclear power has a great deal to do with the breadth of it. Solar power and wind power are two of the oldest technologies that exist. Egyptians, the Chinese, they have used that type of electricity. It is not a new way of producing electricity. We do need to invest significantly more into R&D for wind and solar and other forms of electricity. And Southern Company would certainly never argue that any technology should be better than any other. They all have to be used. They all need to be funded.
Okay, thank you. Sir?
Good morning. My name is Bertram Marks. I'm an attorney, and I'm also a member of the faith community in Michigan. And my question is really directed to Dr. Bishop Black, Dr. Walker, and of course I know you're not on the panel, Dr. Billard, but I'd also include you in this as well. It seems that from a legal perspective, there are certain safeguards that need to be in place when you're dealing with nuclear. There's also, from a stewardship perspective, faith perspective, we need to be good stewards of the earth. Ms. Terry, excellent presentation on the benefits of nuclear. It seems that clearly there are benefits to nuclear, and it also seems clear that there are some challenges with nuclear. My question to you, Bishop Black, and Dr. Walker, and everybody involved in environmental justice is, can we do nuclear? And is it a question of whether or not we should have the NRC requires environmental impact studies? Perhaps the policy that relates to nuclear could include peer reviews from individuals who understand environmental justice and who have labored in environmental justice. And perhaps when it comes to the issue of storage and those types of dangers, maybe the NRC and the power companies' recommendation and scientific data could be peer-reviewed by persons who work in environmental justice. I guess ultimately the question is, are we saying no, or are we saying there's a better way to do it? I personally believe that it's a better way to do it and that we should do it, but we have to do it the right way. And I think that advocates such as you, Bishop Black, and others are leading us to the right way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you answered the question, sir, for the most part. I'm not qualified to speak technically about nuclear energy. I speak about the human aspect of it, and I think perhaps it could be done, but it isn't done right now, in my opinion, the right way. I do not believe that the powers to be in the near future will be bringing EJ community to the table. Until that is done, no, I do not think it can be done where the social, whether the economic benefit would be a blessing to all. So, yes, if some integrity and honesty will be brought to the table. Perhaps so.
Well, I would just say, and I think you guys all spoke eloquently to some of the points I was trying to make as well. You can't do it one side at a time right now. We have to have all the information on the table. We have to know, I mentioned the uranium mining all the way through, but we have to know what our money and investments can do. You did a great presentation. I would love to go back and forth with you about the cost and what the cost, but if we had we are still not convinced, okay, until we have it equally. I think your issue about siting was good. We're going to have a national policy. Some people might not like this because it's a little bit too much of people coming together with corporate. But so how many will we have in this sector? But you can tell my politics means you have to work together, okay? You just can't yet let the competitive forces for money, you also said that, Bishop, decide everything. So even where these are placed, I'm concerned that they're all in the South. And I also think that there's an interesting related issue in all of the public health work I've done. But we have to get the big picture here, guys. I mean, what happens? I mean, I'm still convinced that if we all did some things to our houses, we won't need as much electricity. There's a whole, and that kind of investment and stuff we should be giving to folks. So I think we might have to do it, and there's a better way to do it locally, et cetera, if we do. But everything is not on the table in terms of costs, investments, et cetera. Where are the research and R&D centers for alternative energy? They're very few. They don't have the money. And I understand the money in nuclear has been related to nuclear power and the whole nuclear weapons industry. We're not even talking about it here. We have to get a grips on that, too. Because, in fact, we're spending many, many millions more and even considering alternative nuclear weapons. So we have to get all the facts on the table. So and then we can decide.
Let me just add a footnote to what the question was in terms of can we get the information? Can we work together? If a corporation has an environmental justice policy adopted by that corporation, long before application is even made to my colleague here, this dialogue will have taken place within the community itself. That's the key. Corporations tend to forget that people live in those areas and that decisions that they make impact. If you exclude those people, then you are asking for trouble. So I encourage and have encouraged through the NEJAC and others that every corporation ought to have an environmental justice policy. And if it does, by the time it gets to the application process, as a matter of fact, it wouldn't even get to the application process unless there's general consensus from the communities in which they're going to operate.
Okay, thank you. Sir, we have to speed it up because we got about 8 minutes before luncheon starts, so go right ahead.
I'm Burdell Knowles from Jacksonville Electric Authority in Jacksonville, Florida. And I first of all want to thank Mr. Harris for pointing out of the necessity of environmental justice policy for utilities. That's probably one of the more valuable takeaways I'll have from this session, so thanks very much. I do have a question, just a point of clarification from Ms. Terry, having to do with the cost numbers you cited for electric production from the various sources. I think you said 2 cents for nuclear, 2.5 for coal, and 8 or so cents per kilowatt hour for natural gas. And you also said that your company looks at it in a life cycle perspective. And I'm wondering, was those cost numbers you cited fuel costs, or were they life cycle cost numbers?
Those were life cycle costs, what the customer actually pays when we run that particular form of generation.
Okay, including amortization of the construction cost. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
My name is Keith Crawford, Harvard Medical School. The points I wanted to make with Ms. Terry, I noticed that you were able to give us 5 key points as it relates to why it was important to use nuclear energy, but the one key point was human life. There was an issue concerning life cycle of the plant, but there wasn't an issue concerning life cycle of the people around the plant. And whether there's a focus and a push by the Regulatory Commission to aggressively look at the health impact of low-dose ionizing radiation on the people, not necessarily in the plant, but the people in the community. And I think that that's a key point. It has to be something that's placed on the table. And the key point you can give us a very broad perspective as it relates to how it decreases the amount of pollution that the plant generates. But you have to recognize there's a global picture and there's the small groups of people. And at any given time, low-dose radiation can affect a small group of people and cause cancers.
It's probably one of those points, as the young lady pointed out, who came up earlier, it's probably those points we disagree on. The nuclear industry, including Southern Company, does not agree, not that there isn't low-dose radiation that exists, does not agree that nuclear power plants are detrimental to the communities they're in.
I'm not saying detrimental. What I'm saying is, in the 21st century, there are technologies that can demonstrate DNA damage that none of you have paid for and looked at it. Excuse me, let me finish. The technology does exist. What I'm asking you is to be mindful of what needs to be done and to at least make it part of that 5-point list. Do no harm.
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, I'd like to, on behalf of Congressman Clyburn, thank you for coming to this Braintrust. Yes. You had a question? Okay. Speak.
Thank you. My name.
It's not happening.
Do you know?
Is that a question?
As far as we know, it's not happening.
You know, if Representative Clyburn were here, I would suggest he would stand to this microphone and give you a good answer on that, because he did it in Charleston. Okay, what's going on with Yucca Mountain, okay, is that the NRC at this point in time is reviewing a license application, okay, from the Department of Energy, okay, to ensure that it meets our regulatory, environmental, and safety considerations. But whether or not Yucca Mountain is going to survive, regardless of that NRC review, whether we approve or disapprove, appears to be more contingent upon action in Congress and the Department of Energy associated with the funding for that activity.
Again, thank you. You've had a question already. Yes. We have to conclude this session.